to be together. I'd like to welcome you to our weekly Wednesday gathering. My name is Lisa Zook, and I serve as Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here at Chicago Theological Seminary. I'd like to start off by wishing Ramadan Mubarak to those who are celebrating this holy month. And I want to welcome all of you to our time together. We're in for a treat today as we welcome Dr. Danielle Buhuro, who will give the Victor Obenhaus Lecture. Before we get started, just a reminder to please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking so that we can hear our speaker and our lecturer well. Also, we encourage you to use the chat feature to drop questions or comments as we engage today. There will be Q&A time after the lecture, so you can ask and pose questions or comments through the chat. You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself and speak. So we'll just leave it open. Lots of ways to communicate and be together. Just a reminder that we do record our Wednesday gatherings each week, and the recordings are available from the CTS homepage. So if you enjoy today's lecture, which I'm sure you will, and you want to share it with friends, you can always go there and find it. We welcome everyone here today and extend a special welcome to those who are new or newer to our community. We have a virtual guest book, and we invite you to sign that so that we might keep in touch with you. My colleague Brendan will drop a link to that in the chat as we get going. Friends, we begin each week with words of gathering to draw us into the space together. And today I am pleased to welcome Dr. Hisung Hwang to invite us in. Dr. Hwang is our visiting assistant professor of religious education and public ministry. Hisung, it's a pleasure to welcome you here today.
Thank you, Lisa, and greetings, everyone. And what a joy and honor to see you all in this wonderful occasion with Dr. Buhuro and share some words to center our hearts and mind and spirit to this very moment. So for this morning or this afternoon, I would like to share a poem called The River by Mary Oliver. So feel free to sit back and relax a bit, or close your eyes, or stay open and listen. So here it is. The River by Mary Oliver. Just because I was born precisely here or there, in some cold city or other, don't think I don't remember how I came along like a grain carried by the flood. On one of the weedy threads that poured toward the muddy lightning, surging east, past. Monkeys and parrots, past. Trees with their branches in the clouds until I was spilled forth and slept under the blue lung of the Caribbean. Nobody told me this, but little by little, the smell of mud and leaves returned to me. And in dreams, I began to turn to sense the current. Do dreams lie? Once I was a fish crying for my sisters in the sprawling crossroad of the Delta. Once among the reeds, I found a boat as thin and lonely as a young tree. Nearby, the forest sizzled with the afternoon rain. Home, I said. In every language, there is a word for it. In the body itself, climbing those worlds of white thunder, past those green temples, there is also a word for it. I said, home. Amen. And thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zachary Moon. I am faculty here at Chicago Theological Seminary, and it is my privilege to get to introduce our speaker for today. The Reverend Dr. Danielle J. Buhuro is Executive Director and CPE Supervisor of Sankofa CPE Center, LLC, which offers innovative online clinical pastoral education along with unique social justice-oriented clinical work settings, and prepares clergy chaplains for board certification. Dr. Buhuro is passionate about the issues of race, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of 2 books, both of which are required reading in CTS courses. Is there a heaven for a G, a pastoral care approach to gang violence? And spiritual care in an age of Black Lives Matter, examining the spiritual and prophetic needs of African Americans living in a violent America. Dr. Buhuro has a long relationship with Chicago Theological Seminary. She has earned her Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees here respectively, and she is currently a PhD student studying in the areas of social media identity, violence, and pastoral theology. Today, Dr. Buhuro will speak on the topic, Giving Esther CPR, Sexism in the Black Lives Matter Movement, and Esther's Moral Injury.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moon. I am so excited. Thank you so much to our president, Dr. Marsha Foster Boyd, our dean, our faculty, and all of our friends gathered here in these moments. I say good afternoon, and so good to see each and every one of you. And I am so excited about this opportunity. Hey, if you have an opportunity, please check out my sister, Lena's presentation, which was last week, and it was absolutely marvelous. So I'm going to try to do as well as she did. I'm going to share my screen at this time. Giving Esther CPR, Sexism in the Jewish Lives Matter Movement, and Esther's Moral Injury. We absolutely love her. We love to name her as a shero in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. Every annual Women's Day celebration that I attend, or when I go to the homegoing celebrations of a beloved sister, I often hear her story highlighted during the preached word at multiple churches around the country. Her story is highlighted, and sisters are often chastised to be just like her. Who is she? She is the one we have come to know as Esther. If one doesn't remember any other detail from her story, one is always told to remember her cousin or uncle Mordecai's challenging words to Esther. You have been called for such a time as this. We've heard the story time and time again. Our beloved sister, Esther, is a queen with a secret identity, a secret cultural heritage, not wanting to suffer the plight of Queen Vashti. Our sister, Esther, keeps her identity, her cultural heritage, her religious heritage on the down low in some sense. The king doesn't know her true identity. And then when the nemesis, Haman, decides to devise a plan to extinguish all of the Jewish brothers and sisters from the land, it is Mordecai, an officer in the king's court, who petitions his niece, cousin, to go and say something to her husband, the king, to advocate on behalf of the Jewish brothers and sisters. This moment becomes a Jewish Lives Matter movement or moment. And when she shows the slightest bit of nervousness or anxiety, she is guilted, she is shamed with these words. You have been called for such a time as this. This statement is a statement that's become popular in our religious settings today. We use this statement to somehow challenge, empower sisters in particular to stand up, to fight on behalf of various types of oppressions that exist today. It is believed that when our beloved sister Mamie Till Mobley wrestled with fighting injustice in the name of her assassinated, slain Black boy Emmett Till, preachers in Chicago called her and recited these very words to her. For you have been called for such a time as this. But what we often don't ask is, what was the cost to Esther, however? I contend that with these simple yet challenging words to Esther, Mordecai, in some sense, asks Esther, challenges Esther to be a sacrificial lamb. I even contend that Mordecai causes Esther moral injury. In traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances, people may perpetrate or fail to prevent or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. Moral injury is the distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to such events. A moral injury can occur in response to acting or witnessing behaviors that go against an individual's values and moral beliefs. Mordecai tells Esther that all Jewish lives matter, that she must advocate for the lives of all of her Jewish relatives by revealing Haman's plot to the king. But what about her own life? Mordecai doesn't seem to be concerned about Esther's own life. Didn't Mordecai know that by telling Esther to petition her husband, the king, on behalf of the Jews, Mordecai was actually threatening Esther's own life? Didn't her cousin, uncle, remember what happened to the king's first wife, Vashti? How can all Jewish lives matter, but not Esther's? Ain't she a Jew? I contend that Mordecai causes Esther to experience moral injury. Moral injury is this perpetuating, again, failing to prevent or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations, causing long-term emotional, psychological, behavioral, and sometimes spiritual impacts or effects. And so I invite us to read this story of Esther through the lens of moral injury, where first and foremost, there's an event, then an assessment, then dissonance, experienced as assault on mind and body, possible feelings, then possible behaviors, or maybe back to possible feelings, then back to possible behaviors, then a cycle that repeats. Let me explain this in the context of Esther's story. I am contending or asserting that the question, the challenge, the critique of Mordecai is the injury or event, if you will, causing injury. This challenge, you have been called for such a time as this, I contend, is a potentially damaging event. At which point, in these very moments, it's an assault on the mind of Esther. Esther then has to make an assessment underscoring the fact that if it is in fact the case that all Jewish lives matter, why doesn't hers? Why is it Mordecai is not taking into consideration her own sense of body, mind, and the threat that she inevitably incurs if going to the king petitioning for all the Jews must now reveal her identity, how this can be a life-threatening event or occurrence for her. So she may now struggle, I assert, in her own mental health in some sense, which then leads to a sense of dissonance between appraisal of this event and her own belief system and worldview, that maybe in some sense, all Jewish lives don't matter. Maybe in some sense, only certain Jewish lives matter, which I then assert leads to feelings of shame, guilt, powerlessness, frustration, depression, self-harm, sense of rejection, and even a loss of spirituality, which then leads to possible behaviors of drinking alcohol, exercise, avoidance, keeping busy, self-harm, or burnout. I draw our attention specifically to Esther chapter 4, verse 16, which reads, Esther's response to Mordecai: go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. We have often interpreted Esther 4:16 from a perspective that our sister is rising to the occasion in some sense, from a spiritual perspective of fasting and praying. But I often look at this scripture as really possible behaviors, as you see on this chart, resulting from her experiencing moral injury. This idea of praying and fasting, I say, is a form of avoidance, of keeping busy, if you will. The behavior is indicative of one who has experienced moral injury. I assert that while sometimes we think about praying and fasting as a spiritual perspective or behavior, in particular before one engages in war, if you will, I often wonder if this praying, meditating, and fasting is really an act of moral injury or behaviors indicative of those who have been injured morally, if you will. And I paid a special attention to Esther's final response in this Esther 4:16 verse. After that, I will go to the king, and though it is against the law, if I perish, I perish. I often wonder if this statement is indicative of possible feelings of shame, guilt, and powerlessness. What if we were to read those words through this lens of shame, guilt, and powerlessness, not necessarily her rising to the occasion and being a shero, if you will? What if our thoughts around resiliency and pushing resiliency is actually unhealthy in some sense? Esther's moral injury in the Jewish Lives Matter movement, as I name it, is similar to what I believe Black women activists experience in the many Black Lives Matter movements around the country. In some sense, I assert that similarly, Black women activists experience moral injury because of sexism, patriarchy, homophobia, and transphobia that exists in many Black Lives Matter chapters around the country. Nearly everyone has heard of this hashtag, Black Lives Matter. The hashtag was started in response to the not guilty verdict of George Zimmerman. Zimmerman, a member of his neighborhood watch committee, had been charged with murder after he pursued an unarmed African-American teenage boy named Trayvon Martin in a gated complex while Martin was returning home for purchasing snacks, an Arizona iced tea and a bag of Skittles. Enraged by the injustice of the verdict, 3 African-American lesbian women took to Twitter in protest using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And it went viral, being used nationwide. And the women transformed the hashtag Black Lives Matter into a Black-centered political will and movement building project. While racist violence is ever present through police brutality and those who believe they are in positions of power, there's a growing trend of violence towards Black women. This trend cuts along lines of gender identity. According to the Human Rights Campaign, in 12 months, from October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018, approximately 369 trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people were murdered. And as of November 20th, 2019, the 20th annual Transgender Day of Remembrance, 29 trans people have been killed in 2019. They were predominantly Black trans women, according to GLAAD. While the liberating Black church has gotten on board with the Black Lives Matter movement, where is the response to the Say Her Name campaign, which highlights the murders of Black cisgender women and Black trans women? I assert that there is silence about this topic because discussions on gender and sexuality in the Black church are still a bit taboo. I assert that much of this goes back to Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. It was in the fall of 1929 when Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., pastor of one of the best known Black churches in the United States, Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York, launched a campaign against, quote unquote, homosexuality and other vices in the African American community. In his 1939 autobiography, the Reverend Powell claimed that his motivation for this campaign was to protect the African American family. According to Powell, homosexuality was an alarming social trend that greatly threatened American families, African American families in particular, with men leaving their spouses for other men and women choosing to never marry and instead engaging in relationships with other women. Powell would write in his autobiography, "Why did I preach against homosexuality and all manner of sex perversions? Because as every informed person knows, these sins are on the increase and are threatening to eat the vitals out of America." For years, Powell, and later his son and successor, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., would condemn homosexuality as a sin and use biblical passages to support their views, such as Apostle Paul's text in the epistles. A side note, I would love to see research done on mental health the mental health of Apostle Paul. I've often wondered if Apostle Paul struggled with mental health issues. And that's why many of his writings are sporadic and indicative of bipolar. In fact, in an attempt to get Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to call off a civil rights protest planned for the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles in August of 1960, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was also the Democratic congressman from Harlem, threatened to spread the rumor that Dr. King and LGBTQIA activist Bayard Rustin, who was an important advisor for King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, were in fact lovers. The charge was untrue, but Rustin, an openly LGBTQIA gentleman, was forced to resign from his position with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And in some sense, Dr. King was scared of these rumors. As we celebrated on Monday, April 4th, the 54th anniversary of Dr. King's untimely death, I've often wondered if he, now being on the other side, has regretted how he treated Bayard Rustin. In some sense, I assert that Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Sr. and Jr., struggled with respectability politics. According to LGBTQIA activist and theologian Horace Griffin, heterosexual Black leaders work so hard to seek external validation and equal rights from white counterparts that they desire to look perfect and respectable. In many ways, heterosexual patriarchal Black leaders believe in their mind that LGBTQIA relationships are sinful and therefore don't look perfect and respectable from a heterosexual normative lens. Thus, the plight or oppression against Black LGBTQIA persons goes unnoticed and is not highlighted. The irony for me is these two quotes. One posted by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and a response quote from Bayard Rustin. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. would say one day, unless man is committed to the belief that all mankind are his brothers, then he labors in vain and hypocritically in the vineyards of equality. Bayard Rustin would challenge this quote and say, well, who is all mankind? Is mankind only heterosexual Black men that you refer to? Or is mankind LGBTQIA Black gentlemen? Where exactly is this vineyard of equality, and who exactly is included in this vineyard of equality? And so in response, Bayard Rustin would say, if we desire a society without discrimination, then we must not discriminate against anyone in the process of building this society. I contend that silence around issues of gender and sexuality oppression are most prevalent within justice-seeking organizations. In the same way that during the civil rights movement, while the topic at hand was always racism, we often don't spend time talking about the great levels of sexism and homophobia and transphobia that existed in the civil rights movement. Today, we see, I believe, the same dynamic is evident. I turn to the high rates of sexism and transphobia that exist within many local Black Lives Matter chapters. The irony, the sheer irony is that oftentimes the daily operations of many of these chapters are facilitated by either Black cisgender women or Black trans women. Thus, I argue that Black cisgender and Black trans women experience moral injury from within the Black Lives Matter movement. In some sense, there are many Black cisgender women activists and Black trans women activists who know exactly what Esther was experiencing when challenged by Mordecai. I lift up today the work of Lizaya Wade, a Black trans woman living here in Chicago, who is the founder and executive director of Brave Space Alliance. If you don't know, ironically, she is also the president of the local Chicago Black Lives Matter online group on Facebook. If you were to like this Facebook page, Black Lives Matter Chicago Facebook page chapter, you would see that she is the facilitator of the page. I did an ethnographical study of this particular Facebook page about 1 year ago. I also, side note, assert that social media is becoming and is currently the new space and place where pastoral care is needed, like now more than ever. I assert that social media, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter in particular, is the new space and place where violence at all-time high rates are given or put on African-American female online activists like never before. I turn to the ways in which, for example, Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes, a pastoral theologian today, has been the victim of much hate in recent days, in recent years. The ways in which Congresswoman Maxine Waters has been the victim of much online hate in recent years, even by our former president, Donald Trump. And I've seen this in particular with our sister, Lizaya Wade. For example, I've noticed in an ethnographical study that she receives much love, many blue likes, many red hearts, whenever she posts about stories of victimization towards young African-American boys who have experienced violence at the hands of the police. But the irony is, whenever she posts about the murder of a Black trans victim of violence, she is met with the angry emoji. She is met with mean and vicious homophobic comments. She is even challenged on whether or not she should still remain as the facilitator of this Facebook group. She is never removed. What is the irony of that? That this Facebook group is run by a Black trans woman who is open about her identity, yet she can never post anything that highlights transphobia towards Black women, Black trans women in particular. Things that make you go, So the question I often grapple with is, when we say Black Lives Matter, whose life in particular matters? Black men, Black cis women, or Black trans women? I assert that in order to combat moral injury, that Black women activists turn to the biblical narrative of Esther as a spiritual care resource. Esther's own experience of moral recovery, I say, was aided by a strategy called cultural pride reinforcement. What do I mean by that? In some sense, I assert that cultural pride reinforcement is a dimension of racial socialization through which African American parents draw children's attention to many of the cultural strengths that have historically supported African Americans in our American society. Through this process, African American heritage and culture is found as helpful resources for the growth and survival of African American children in particular. What if, in some sense, we were to use cultural pride reinforcement with our Black trans community in particular? What if, in some sense, we were to highlight all of the wonderful gifts of gender identity and sexuality as culture, and elicit cultural pride, so to speak, if you will, as a wonderful aid to moral injury? Haman, according to our Esther text, Haman's plot is eventually revealed. And at the end of our Esther text, Esther chapter 9, verses 24 to 29 in particular, we see that Esther uses, in some sense, cultural pride reinforcement to minister to her own moral injury. Our text highlights that the queen fixed the practices of Purim as forever an annual celebration to be recorded in writing and to be celebrated. What if we were to use her cultural pride reinforcement as a Jewish woman through the lens of also helping Black women activists? What if we were to say to our Black sisters who are activists in the Black Lives Matter movement, use her sense of cultural pride reinforcement to minister to your own moral injury? I venture to say, as social justice activists who experience moral injury in our Black Lives Matter movements, Black women in particular, what are the ways in which we could reflect on, through cultural pride reinforcement, words by Tamar Bryant in her recent publication, Homecoming? Use these words to, in some sense, focus our Black women activists back to their story, their cultural pride, if you will, by reflecting on these words. In what ways have you sat on your wings? In what ways have you minimized your voice and silenced yourself? When have you sought approval, validation, or attention from people who require you to be someone you're not? How did you abandon yourself in workspaces or relationships? In this season, healing and homecoming to yourself requires recognizing and reclaiming the parts of yourself that you left behind. Maybe Michelle Obama got it wrong. Maybe life is not about becoming, but maybe unbecoming. Everything that sought to take away your authentic identity. Was it your courage, grief, culture, style, dreams, voice, body, spirituality, softness, playfulness, or fire? Whatever it was, go back and reclaim you. Thank you.
Friends, we have time for questions, comments, feedback, things that stood out to you, things you'd like to hear a little bit more about. Floor is open. You can unmute yourself and speak. You can drop a question in the chat, or you can use the little reaction button and raise your hand. So give you some space here.
I'm an ordained member of the United Church of Christ, but before that I was Baptist. So I really need some talk back. So my Baptist pastor used to say, if nobody says nothing, then I'm gonna keep talking, and we just be here for another couple of hours. So if somebody please, let's have some conversation. I would love to know your thoughts. This is a part of my PhD work. So if you want to help me to graduate on time, I would appreciate some feedback.
We've got a hand raised. I think that's Marie.
Okay.
It is. Thank you. In your chaplaincy work, how do you keep from folding under the pressure?
For me, cultural pride reinforcement is so powerful, I believe. And so I utilize this in my own life from a womanist theologian perspective. I think about the words of my grandmother and her encouragement to me when I was young, and what are the ways in which she instilled a sense of keep going, if you will. She oftentimes would quote the words of Harriet Tubman to me. If you hear the dogs barking, keep going. When you hear the guns of slave masters shooting, keep going. When you hear the horses that the slave masters are riding on, even closely behind you, just keep going. And so I really believe that it is important to cultural pride reinforcement is so important to highlight. During this season of Lent, I'm a member of Trinity United Church of Christ in Gary, Indiana. During this season of Lent, we have been reading Dr. Stephanie Crowder's book, When Mama Speaks. And we have been focusing on this brilliant and prolific work. And so I've been thinking about the particular mothers that Dr. Crowder highlighted in her work. What are the ways in which these mothers highlight cultural pride reinforcement in some sense in their belief systems and sayings to their children and to their grandchildren. And so because I'm not one for talking, saying one thing without practicing it, I've been really trying to work on how to utilize this in my own life.
Thank you.
Marco has a hand up, and then Marva.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. I was very active in Black Lives Matter here in Chicago and also in the Twin Cities, especially during George Floyd and in Chicago with Laquan McDonald. I was not aware of, I thought Black Lives Matter was led by, mostly about 3 queer women. And I wasn't aware of the alienation that these leaders may feel, because when you think of it, they're the leaders, You know, like, why would the leaders be alienated in their own movement? You know, so you bring up some things to ponder about. I wanted to discuss a conversation I had posted maybe some years ago on Facebook, and I was talking about the woman caught in adultery, and I wondered, why was the woman such an emphasis in that story? You know, because it takes two to commit adultery. You know, but so I was met by two local pastors, pretty popular pastors here in Chicago, and they pretty much shut me down in regards, you know, of saying that certain biblical characters and things, they, you know, there was a presence of male chauvinists within biblical culture. And they just basically told me that I had all my theology wrong, and you know, basically I was, you know, they intimidated me as local pastors. And, you know, basically one told me that, well, I'm working on my doctorate in, so it was an interesting discussion. I was kind of alienated, outcasted by these local male pastors just for entertaining the idea that that culturally, you know, there might have been male chauvinistic characters in the Bible, you know. So yeah, just kind of,
Yeah, like Apostle Paul, huh?
yeah. So just kind of want feedback on that.
Yeah, no, my brother, I so appreciate what you're saying. I was having a conversation with Dr. Joanne Terrell last week, and I really want us to look at respectability politics and the ways in which respectability politics shows up in social justice movements. At the end of the day, I'm invested in the ways in which we continue to wrestle with image in African American circles, and the impact of image is at the heart of this conversation. So I'm also asking us to reflect on whatever is the particular ism that we find ourselves engaging in each of our own social justice activism circles. I think from a CPE perspective, here we go. I'm gonna shift to a CPE perspective. Who is the voice that's not included? Who is the voice that is being left out? I believe that that's the reflective question for us to grapple with. Who is the voice that's not at the table? Who is the voice that's not included? Whatever is the ism, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, if we keep at the center whatever oppression we're raging against, who is the voice that's not at this table? I believe that will help us be more sensitive.
Yeah, but how can we you know, speak of the Bible authority and canonized, you know, the Bible being a source that is without flaws? You know, are we saying that the Bible is without flaws, or are we saying that the Bible does consist these biases?
I believe that the Bible is with flaws, right? Because the Bible was written by man. Mm-hmm. God self did not physically write the Bible. So the very nature of the Bible being written by human beings causes for flaws. I have sinned technically against the Bible right now, because according to Leviticus, I'm wearing a fabric that's a muck cloth for my top and I'm wearing pants that's cotton, and I have mixed fabrics. And so I have sinned, according to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and wearing two different fabrics. And so in some sense, there's a lot of dynamics about the Bible that is questionable in some sense. And so another reflective question for us is, can we count the cost of what will be lost? Can we count the cost of what will be lost when we are engaging in justice circles and lift up? There are certain voices that are not here, that are not at this table. What is lost? Like, can we count the cost of that and fully accept those costs and be okay with accepting those costs, that we may lose particular relationships, we may lose particular opportunities. I am one who I've been able to achieve a lot of opportunities and receive a lot of opportunities. And at the same time, I'm also sensitive to, as a LGBTQIA, as a gay, queer, Black woman, there are certain churches that I have never been invited to speak at and will never be invited to grace those pulpits, right? But those are certain costs that I accept. I accept those costs every time I look at particular churches, 7 last word services, and like, damn, I ain't never got an invitation to that church. I'm sorry for saying damn. I'm sorry for saying damn during chapel service. But I do think that we have to be okay with the costs.
Yeah, thank you. I want to give you the opportunity to answer other questions. I also saw that Howard John Wesley, he's catching some heat, and he's really kind of being alienated from the Baptist convention based off of some of his biblical stances. So thank you.
Like for Black men to challenge other Black men. I often wonder about Esther. What would it have looked like for, instead of asking Esther to challenge the king, what would it have looked like for Mordecai to challenge the king? I've often wondered, what would it have looked like for Mordecai to challenge the king? Thank you.
Danielle, we're running up on time, but there are 2 folks with their hands up. I wonder if maybe we could get their questions in, Marva and Melissa, and then see if you can answer them quickly as we're getting close to the top of the hour. Oh, Marva, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I'd like to thank Reverend Dr. Buhuro for that lovely presentation. And it gives us a lot to think about. And especially with Republicans passing laws that are saying you can't have books. I mean, this sounds like we're in situations where books were not allowed and that kind of thing. So in Gary, I was responsible for passing policy that included Black history curriculum. And now the state has said you can't teach Black history, and they want to throw it in with the CRT study at the level of college. So I just think we need more activists. We need more people at the table because it's just becoming unbearable. How can we do cultural pride if we can't teach history, Black history? So I don't know if you can respond to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
Melissa, did you want to share your comment or question?
Yes, I am in Dr. Buchanan's Womanist Biblical Interpretation class, and also I'm reading that book that you're reading for your church, and also reading wonderful other supplementary books. And this week we are going to have a guest lecturer, Gay Byron, I believe. And one of the essays talks about Fannie Lou Hammer. I'd never heard of her, but she gives that phrase that you were talking about that Queen Esther was under. And she repeats that in a lot of her speeches. So that got me to thinking, and I appreciate that because it gives another look at what that meant for Black women and how they might have felt subjugated and oppressed by that statement of the Bible. I just wanted to thank you. And I think earlier this semester I had contacted you about any more spots that you might have open in your CPE roster this summer. Have they all been filled?
No, send me an email offline.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present my work. I so appreciate this opportunity. I am humbled. I don't take this moment lightly. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Buhuro. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for helping us to think deeper, as always, to question what's there on the surface and to take it deeper. It's always a pleasure to have you here with us. Friends, as you know, we on a weekly basis, we give away a Starbucks gift card to one of our students to help make your study time maybe a little bit more caffeinated. And this week we'll be sending that out to Nolan Shaw. So watch your email, Nolan. Next week, friends, we celebrate our second spring convocation, and we are featuring Reverend Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder. Her address is entitled Me-demic in a Pandemic, Righteous Indignation and Resistance to More. So very much looking forward to that. The same link that brought you here today will bring you back next week. So I very much hope that you will join us. Again, special thanks to Danielle Buhuro for your words today, for being with us, for your presence. And best wishes to everyone. Go in peace. See you next week.
Bye-bye.